Yeah.
I'm honored to have with me today Professor Emeritus Benjamin Arbel from Tel Aviv University. Professor Arbel is a giant in his field and has published dozens of articles on Venetian Cyprus and several monographs, including Trading Nations, Jews and Venetians in the Early Modern Eastern Mediterranean, Cyprus, the Franks and Venice, 13th to 16th centuries, and studies on Venetian Cyprus. That's not to mention the many edited books and special publications that he's put out as well. Today, he's here with us to talk about a very misunderstood era in Cypriot history, and that is Cyprus under Venice. Benjamin, again, it is a pleasure and welcome.
Yeah. Good evening.
It's great just to talk to someone whose work I've read, the letters, the Venetian letters that you published through the
Uh-huh.
Bank of
Uh-huh.
Cyprus, I believe. I was so drawn into reading these letters and seeing the facsimiles, the photocopies of them.
Well, when I was approached by the Bank of Cyprus Cultural Foundation, they invited me to come over and have a look at this material, and I really liked the idea of collecting them because some of them well, at that time at least, part of private collections. I had to go around Cyprus and talk to people and try to persuade them to let me publish, because they are collectors. They are who are unable to read and understand what they possess. For them, it was a sort of a service I did for them.
Now, when you
Uh,
say private collection, and forgive my ignorance, are these purchased through, let's say, auctions, or were they letters that were bequeathed generation to generation?
I think they are offered in auctions, as far as I know, most of them. And what is worse, many of them were simply stolen from archives, from the Venetian State Archives, and more particularly, and many years ago, uh, and reached the market, and then changed hands
Hmm.
through
Now,
auctions. Yes, yeah. If you noticed in that volume, I didn't say so openly and explicitly, but if you read the notes I wrote, for instance, that letter was most probably part of the series Papapam, in the Venetian State Archive in the past, or something like that.
I'm guessing you've been to Venice many times. I'm going to go on a limb there. And is it easy to have access to the state archives in Venice?
Yes,
Is it?
it's very easy. It's very easy. It's very easy. I mean, it's a very nice public service. All state archives in Italy are quite open and collaborative. Last month I was in Italy. I went through three of them actually: Modena, Mantova, and Venice, and it was a very pleasant experience. Yeah. Not only for me, but also young people, PhD students, and so on. Not only established scholars like myself. I mean,
Right. And I
it's
mean the increased digitization of these archives must make it infinitely easier to access them from abroad. At least that's what I would assume.
most of the material, the greatest part of the material is not digitalized.
Oh, okay, that's unfortunate.
Yes,
Do you do
you
you
have.
know if they have any plans on digitizing them?
Well, there are different projects. The progress is very slow because they don't have enough funding for that, and well, it will take several more generations before it's really. Venice is the biggest state archive in Italy. It's huge. It is actually the archive of the Republic, of the old Republic, and it's huge. It's endless. You cannot imagine how much material there still is. Material which has never been, used for research or for anything else.
So certainly, there's a lot more resources as with regards to Cyprus that hasn't been accessed.
Yeah, undoubtedly so. Yes.
Wow. Okay. I feel like one of the themes that runs through your work is redressing many of the misconceptions around Venetian rule. The claim that Cyprus experienced a quote, and I quote, a period of negligence and decay. And I think you even call this the Black Legend. So, what is this Black Legend, and where do we get this idea that this was a period of decline?
Well, it's really a very curious story. When I try to put together all the relevant material related to this image, this very very negative image of the Venetian period, this more or less a century of Venetian rule, a very static image, as if nothing could change, everything was bad from the beginning to the end. It's really it sounds strange, if not to say ridiculous, because nothing. I mean, in history, everything changes all the time. It depends only on the rhythm, on the direction, and some ups and down. I mean, it's impossible to imagine a situation which is 100 years or so totally, absolutely negative. Now, let me start. If I allow myself to read about 6 or 7 lines where it all started. It all started actually before I read the paragraph. It all started in France. The main person responsible for this image is a scholar called Louis de Maslatry, a French scholar, quite well known for many publications that he published, who in the mid 19th century was sent by the French authorities to Cyprus to collect evidence, documents, whatever he could find about uh, what the French then conceived as the French rule of Cyprus, which is already a problematic terminology. I mean, we have to remember this was the height of colonial period. European powers contended for the rule of overseas territories in Africa, in the Far East, and also in the Mediterranean. And France was one of these powers. And colonialism was not such a pejorative term as it is today. On the contrary, there were ministries of colonial administration and international conferences on exhibitions on colonial affairs. There were shops with colonial products and so on. So this is now Maslatry published 3 volumes of documents that he found, not necessarily in Cyprus, but related to Cyprus during the rule of the Lusignan dynasty, a really French a nobleman who took part in the Crusades, during the Middle Ages, and settled in the Levant, in the East, in the 11th and 12th centuries. On their way, these waves, one of these crusades, also included Cyprus, which was not a part of a Muslim empire like the other territories where the Crusaders settled. It was a Byzantine territory belonging to the Byzantine Empire. But the the Crusaders didn't care very much about these small differences, and the one who conquered the island was Richard Lionheart, the famous English king, who later passed it because he had more important things to do to a certain Guy de Lusignan, who was the head of the family of the Lusignan, a French noble family, and this dynasty ruled Cyprus until the early 1470s, when the Venetian period began.
Hmm.
So this is how Maslatri, in the third volume of the documents that I just mentioned, describes what happened during the Venetian period in Cyprus. I'm translating it from the French into English. The workshops were nearly totally destroyed. Trade languished. Men of substance emigrated. Schools were closed. Landlords abandoned their properties. Streams invaded the lowlands, creating infected swamps. Private and public resources diminished everywhere. Historical testimonies reflect a general impoverishment of all the elements that had been at the basis of the island's prosperity under the old kings, and the insufficiency of measures occasionally taken by Venice as remedies. End of citation. You see, so this is a very this is what I can tell you now on the basis of my many years of research on Venetian Cyprus. Nothing of that, of these the series of generalization, is based on any serious evidence. Nothing,
Hmm.
absolutely nothing. And this is incredible because this guy Maslatri was quite an important scholar, and although the 3 volumes of documents are sometimes uh, not at the height of they are sometimes very careless works. I suspect that he paid someone to do the job for him because it was not very important for him. Anyhow, what is even more astonishing is the fact that already the book where it was published appeared in 1871, and already in the 1870s other scholars simply repeated these statements time and again between the 1870s and the 1990s. Just imagine, there
That's very
was
recent.
that's relatively very recent. I have a list of names. I will not tire you with the name of the authors who repeated and sometimes even added some other pejorative descriptions of that terrible period when Cyprus was ruled by Venice. This is really a black legend, and it's this depressing, isn't as a historian. It depressed me to find out how people are totally uncritical when repeating, copying from one another, and these statements without any attempt to look more critically at these sentences. There were a few exceptions, starting with George Hill, the famous, very important English scholar. He was the director of the British Library, and he published the 3-volume History of Cyprus, which is really still an important work of research. And he was much more cautious and critical, using the historical material available to him. There is also a Cypriot scholar, Theodore Papadopoulos. I don't know if you came across this name. He was important. He passed away already several years ago. In a short chapter of 12 pages dedicated to Venetian Cyprus in the series History of the Greek People that appeared in Athens, he also looked at things differently. But as I told you, until the mid 1990s, this black legend continued to appear once in a while.
What does the archaeological evidence suggest? And for example, the decay of the Kyrenia fortifications and the focus on military fortifications in Nicosia and Famagusta, they've been used to validate Venice's indifference to the local population. But you were actually writing one of your papers on the contrary, and I quote, "On the contrary, the period of Venetian domination was most likely a golden age." End quote. So, how have you challenged this this
Well, I
idea
began.
that
This was the subject of my PhD. This is the research that I began in 1974, and it took me 8 years to conclude it until it was approved by the Senate of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem in 1982. And my approach was that of a social and economic historian, and I very much a central element of my research at the beginning of my research. I started to look for demographic evidence on populations, on not on anecdotes, but materials, numerical evidence, materials that can give me an idea about long-term development of one century. Yes, and so I expected, of course, some difficulties, but I think I succeeded in using the evidence, most of which I found in Venice in the Venetian State Archive, that were quite the opposite of what Maslatri and the others tried to argue. Cyprus, at the beginning of Venetian rule or at the end of the Lusignan rule, numbered about 120,000 inhabitants. That is that's very very small number. Yes, of course. At the end of the Venetian rule, or on the eve of the Ottoman invasion of 1570, it nearly reached 200,000 souls. So, despite the fact that in the meantime there were also the pest reached Famagusta, but the Venetians were able to block its propagation to other parts of the island. I mean, they were really quite successful in conducting virtually a campaign for the repopulation of the island. I mean, they invested great efforts to convince people to settle in Cyprus, people from other Venetian territories, Christians from Syria, for instance, Maronites, inhabitants of former Venetian colonies that were conquered by the Ottomans in 1540, for instance. They invited them to settle in Cyprus. They even subsidized the travel expenses of at the one point of people who were ready to come to Cyprus. So this is and of course public works like drying up the Costanza swamps near Famagusta, organizing a new water supply system also in Famagusta, building or rebuilding or restoring the walls of Famagusta and building those of Nicosia, which were practically inexistent in the early 1560s, and so on and so forth.
What drew Venice to Cyprus? What was the appeal to controlling this island in the Eastern Mediterranean?
Well, the Eastern Mediterranean was a very important area for Venetian trade. Venice had, in the 15th century, hegemony in this area, in the international maritime trade in this area. This is where all the spices arrived from the Far East to the ports of the Levant. This is where the silk arrived from far away, from Central Asia, or even further to the Mediterranean. This is where all kinds of local products were produced and exported, natural products too, like ashes of certain plants used in the Venetian glass industry, famous Venetian glass. The cotton, the Syrian cotton, was of utmost importance, like the one grown on Cyprus, by the way, for Venice transported great quantities of cotton from Syria and from Cyprus to Venice, and where it was purchased especially by German merchants who took them for the industries of southern Germany. Alexandria was also an important outlet of merchandise that came from far away. So the eastern and Cyprus was really in the heart of this area. Cyprus, with its protected port of Famagusta and with the salt at the Saline of Larnaca, offered an ideal base, also for unpredictable situations. Venetian ships sometimes reached Cyprus. Cyprus was also a center of information. Information reached Cyprus from Syria, from Egypt. Sometimes it was too dangerous or risky to continue and to end up, in one of the ports of Syria or Alexandria, and then, face harassments or all kinds of difficulties. So they could stop in Cyprus and investigate what's the situation further on in the provinces of the Ottoman Empire, and only once they decide that everything is okay and secure, they continued further on. And if not, they simply unloaded their merchandise in Cyprus and let local smaller crafts carry it at some later stage eastwards, and vice versa.
In the years preceding the Venetians, it seems to be characterized by upheaval. We have bouts of plague, Mamluk invasion. Would you characterize this period as a turbulent time?
Yes, yes, of course. There was also a civil war, and there was a war for the inheritance of the crown when last king died, and his daughter, who was married to the Duke of Savoy, and his illegitimate son, King Jacques II, or in English James, but they were French speaking, the ruling group. So I'll continue calling him Jacques, and. And the nobility, the ruling group, yes, of Cyprus, the noblemen were split to two groups. There was really a fight between them, and when Jacques had the upper hand, all the supporters of his half sister had to leave the island. Jacques himself conquered Famagusta from the Genoese, because Genoese held Famagusta from the late 14th century to the 1460s. So there was war. There were plagues that decimated the population. It was really. And there were incursions. There was an incursion in the 1420s, a Genoese incursion on Limassol, and before that, a Mamluk incursion that distracted and burnt down Limassol. It was really a very poor state of affairs, and King Jacques, once he took over the rule of Cyprus, married a Venetian, the daughter of a Venetian patrician, the Caterina Cornaro, the famous Caterina, Queen Caterina. And when he himself died at a relatively young age, in 1473, his wife Caterina, with a small baby, who was born shortly afterwards, was left alone on the crown. on the not on the crown, of course, on the how do you call it, the seat of kings, the uh, and and Venice at that time was conducting a long and tedious war against the Ottoman Empire. I'm talking about 1473, yes. So, and the war that started in 1463 and ended in 1479. For Venice, it was of great importance to keep Cyprus at least as a comfortable base of operations, not only for military operations, but also because Venice had hegemony actually in the field of international trade, in maritime trade, and especially trade with the Levant, what we call the Levant, the Eastern Mediterranean. So that's the background for the Venetian intervention to protect the queen, the Venetian queen, and to prevent other powers from taking hold of the island.
Now, it emerges as a protectorate between 1473 and 1489, and then later on between 1489 and 1571 to the end of Venetian rule, it's known as, I suppose, Venetian colonial rule. What's the difference between the two? What characterizes one differently than the other?
It's a very slight formal difference. Actually, for all practical purposes, from the last days of 1473, actually we can say beginning from 1474, from January 74, for all practical purposes, Cyprus was under Venetian rule. The queen was still there, but she didn't have any say. She had two so-called counselors, Venetian patricians, who told her what to do and how to do. There were governors of the main urban centers and fortresses, and I mean the normal way pattern of colonial rule that Venice was. Well, Venice was a very experienced colonial power. Venice controlled and dominated wide territories, overseas territories, such as Crete, such as the island of Corfu, such as the entire Dalmatian coast, also islands in the Aegean. So they were very well versed in how to do it, and but they were prudent enough not to make drastic changes before preparing the terrain, especially bringing the war with the Ottoman to termination, and not less important, convincing the Mamluks who ruled Egypt and Syria and considered themselves as overlords of Cyprus. This is a heritage of earlier events. In the 1420s, the Mamluks invaded Cyprus and took prisoner the King Janus, the Lusinian, was taken prisoner, and the condition for releasing him was that the Cypriot pay an annual tribute of 8,000 gold ducats. That's quite a nice sum to the Mamluks as a sign of the Mamluk overlordships over the island. I mean, it was a formal overlordships, but Venice did not want the Mamluks to oppose a Venetian domination of the island, and Venetian diplomacy was very, very experienced and knew how to deal with the Mamluks. So they sent an ambassador that negotiated with them. And at the end, when the war with the Ottoman ended, once the war with the Ottoman ended, and the Mamluks were ready to continue to receive the money, the 8,000 ducats from Venice instead of the Lusinian kings, things were ready for a formal annexation. But as I said, for all practical purposes, Venice ruled Cyprus already in 1474.
So it was very serendipitous that Catherine Cornaro inherited the crown, so to speak. I don't know if I can articulate this well, but were plans already in motion for
Well,
Venice
at
to?
when the decision was taken in Venice, the queen's relatives, who were Venetian patricians, who were part of the ruling group of Venice, the patricians, they were sent to the island to convince her to give up the crown and return home, so to speak. She was also promised a very nice estate in the mainland, in the Venetian mainland in northern Italy, at a place called Asolo, where she spent the rest of her life.
As you mentioned, and we're going to talk a little bit about this a little bit more in depth, we have a period of, I suppose, decline, population decline, leading up to Cyprus's emergence as a Venetian protectorate. And by 1514, the population, it stabilizes, and we know this from population surveys, which, admittedly, for reasons I'm sure you'll probably touch on, they can also be problematic. But the fact is, Venetians, they start executing these massive population surveys. And what I want to know is, what is this data used for? And I mean, what are they intended for? Why are they conducting these population surveys for? As far as I know, I'm probably wrong. It's the first time something like this has been undertaken.
If I'm not mistaken, the first one was carried out by the Venetians in the early 1480s, for 1484 or something like that. And then again, the second one in the 1490s, and then yes, and so forth. Well, the main purpose, Cyprus was the great majority of Cypriots at that time were peasants. Yes, about 85% of the population inhabited the rural settlements, villages of various kind and dimension, and the rest lived in the towns. The purpose of the censuses, the population censuses, was a bit different in the each one of these sectors. In the rural areas, the main purpose was a fiscal one, because the peasants had fiscal obligations. They had to pay taxes according to their respective status, because it is important to clarify that Venice inherited a kingdom whose principal method of organization, social and economic activity, was that of a feudal state. That means that each village or even group of villages was part of a feudal estate. It had a lord, and the lord had rights, and the peasants, according to their respective status, owed all kinds of imposts and services to the landlord, to the lord of the estate. Now, the lords of the estate were most of them noblemen, but there were also estates belonging to the church, and there were estates belonging to the republic, to the ruling republic. About 25% of the villages belonged to the state. The others to private feudatories, and to church, and also military. There were military orders, the Hospitallers, who owned a lot of estates in Cyprus. So the census, the population census, its primary role was to note down how many peasants there were in each village and what their fiscal obligations were. I mean, how much did they have to pay to the landlord? How much did they have to pay to the state? Because the taxation was had two levels. The local one concerned the imposts, taxes, and services owed by the peasants to the lord of the domain, lord of the estate. And the second level concerned the obligations of the same peasants to the state. So this every 4 or 5 or 10 years, they performed these censuses to see who died, who was still alive, and how old they were, because the age was also of a certain importance. Of course, very old people could not perform services that young people did, and so on. So everything had to be noted down. And unfortunately, we do not have even one detailed census which covers the entire island. My job was very difficult to try to reconstruct the whole demographic development on the basis of partial extent documentation. Now, fiscal purpose is the first purpose. A second one is, I would say, military information or military obligations. To put it in a better, military obligation of the peasants. For instance, peasants were obliged to serve as a coast guard during the day and during the night. Yes, there were two basic types of or statuses of peasants. The one were the serfs. There was still many serfs. The servile population who had to pay money dues, money imposts to the landlord, and crop sharing. They had to contribute up to 40% of the crops of their personal plot or to the landlord. And the other group were the Francomati, so-called free lefteri, free peasants, but they too had different obligations. For instance, the Parici guarded the coast during the day and the Francomati during the night, and so on.
I'm familiar, having spoken with Nikos Koureas, I'm familiar with these social divisions within Cyprus during the Frankish era. I was assuming that there would have been a change, and so what I'm to gather is that there wasn't a change under the Venetians. This serfdom was still in place all the way till the Ottoman era.
Yes, but there were small changes. There were not the basic distinction between different social groups remained the same. But Venice was Cyprus was unique actually, because in all other territories dominated by Venice, there were no serfs anymore. Neither in northern Italy, nor in Crete, nor elsewhere. Cyprus was unique in this respect.
And why so? Why did it stay that way?
Because it was an anachronistic social and economic system that nobody had probably the interest to. Or to put it better, those who had the power to change it had no interest to do so, or they thought that they didn't have the interest to do so, at least. So the Venetians were very much aware of the peculiar situation they encountered there, and in the course of time introduced changes. For instance, Parici had labor services to perform. Yes, they had to work 2 or 3 days per week in the landlord's, in the part of the estate that was run directly by the landlord. by using, the work of Parici, who also had their proper plots. Sorry. What the Venetians did was a gradual reduction of this obligation from the age of 40 until the age of 60, at which point the Parici, the old Parici, did not have to contribute these working days to their lords. Yes, several imposts like the marriage dues. I mean, Parici had to pay their lords a tax for his consent to a certain marriage. Yes, of a daughter or son of a paric. This was abolished. Widows tax. Widows who lost their husband at a relatively young age had to pay a special tax to encourage them to find a new parico, a new husband.
Mm,
But
that's
this
that's
this was also abolished by the Venetians. The Venetians also abolished the animal tax. The peasants did not have to pay tax on the animals they had in their farms. So there were small changes. Parici who could afford it could also buy their freedom.
yeah. That
Uh,
was and that was another question I had. I mean, you could enfranchise yourself. It
You
seems.
could, but the number of Parici who were able to do so economically was rather small. So this,
So
uh,
was there social mobility? I mean, to just piggyback off the last question here, because we know of several Greek noble families, and including I think Gondostefani, Singlitiki, pronounce that
yes, in
correct?
Litikos, yes, yes, yes,
Okay,
yes, yes,
Singlitikos. Now,
yes.
what do those families teach us about Venetian Greek relations? Because they, in particular, seem to have a very malleable identity. In order to kind of function in the nobility, they have to sort of navigate their Greek identity, and adopt certain Venetian characteristics, I suppose. What does that teach us about the social mobility of the era?
Well, these few about not more than 10 noble families of Greek background, I would say, I call it, began their social ascent before the beginning of Venetian rule. I mean, they were already there as noblemen when, or nearly all of them, when Venice took over in 1473 or 74, and their Greek background or identity did not play a very important role, I think, in with regard to Venetian to Venice accepted there as a fait accompli. They did not bother to make distinction whether one spoke Greek or Italian or French or whatever. I mean, the Venetians were quite open in this respect at that stage, at that historical stage, because in Crete, for instance, when Venice took over Crete in the beginning of the 13th century, but that was a totally different situation because Venice conquered Crete militarily, and it was quite difficult to establish themselves there. But once they did so, they tried to prevent, not very successfully, the social ascent of Greeks into the ruling group of Crete, of the island of Crete. But that was in the 13th century. We are now talking about late 15th and 16th century. Venice already did not waste much energy in making these distinctions. I mean, I studied the Singlitico family quite thoroughly, and published an article on them. They occupied all the most prestigious titles and positions in the island, and they represented the Cypriot nobility in Venice when it was deemed necessary. They occupied the position of the Viscount of Nicosia, which was a very prestigious position. Their daughters married Venetian patricians with very weighty dowries. So that was, I mean, that was taken for granted. I mean, they didn't had special difficulties in reaching these positions.
Since the Council of Florence in 1439, Cypriot Greeks, they weren't considered schismatics. And so you actually, a quote from one of your articles, you write, so social division based on religious affiliation could therefore scarcely be justified, end quote. So what might else explain the limited numbers of royal families? Because
What do
as
you
you
mean, royal
mentioned,
families, of noble families?
of noble families, I said royal again, of noble families, you mentioned there's at most there were 10. So why
Yes,
were
I
they
mean,
so limited?
yes, because that's very simple. Not because they were Greek, because there were very few noble families in Cyprus during the Venetian period. There were probably, who knows, 60, 70 families altogether who were recognized as noblemen. That resulted from, from the struggle between different groups before the Venetian takeover, between Charlotte's supporters and Jacques' supporters, and also because of natural, process of families die out once they don't have male descendants to continue the name, and Venice had no interest at all to nominate new noblemen or noblewomen, especially since according to the feudal the principle the basic principles of feudal organization, once a family dies out, their estate returned to the overlord, which is the Venetian Republic. So they had no interest of having more noblemen around.
One of my favorite anecdotes is from the Chronicle of Leondios Macheras, going back to the before the Venetian era. He shares a story of Queen Charlotte not being able to read French for her marriage contract and requiring a Greek translation. And it's well established that many of these crusading, these families, these Frankish families from the crusading states that established themselves in Cyprus, eventually saw themselves as Cypriots. Did we have any of that happening in the amongst Venetians? Was there Venetian settlement, and did they assimilate in any way to quote unquote Cypriot culture?
I don't think so. Actually, there were quite a few Venetian. I hesitate even to call them settlers. I mean, Venetian families who had estates in Cyprus, very well-off families. The Corner della Regina, they call them, because they were the relatives of the Queen Caterina, or the Corner d'Episcopia, who had were overlords were the lords of the village of Episcopia, which was one of the richest and biggest villages on Cyprus. There were a few others, but really very few, and they consider themselves Venetians. Many of them even did not really live continuously on Cyprus. They had their estates there, their agents who managed the estates for them, and they preferred to live in Venice. There were no, and again, comparing the situation in Crete, it was a different situation, because in Crete, I've just explained that the beginning of Venetian rule in Crete goes back to the early 13th century, and they held Crete for about 400 years until the mid 17th century. But there, right at the beginning, Venice sent Venetian settlers to Crete, and these settlers, you know, in the long run, at one point, at least part of them intermarrying also with local people from the local elites, Greek Cretans, and so on. They were a bit, how do you call it, Grecized. They became a bit a Greek, or more than a bit Greek, and talked Greek and had Greek names, but that did not develop. I mean, the period was also shorter, the period of domination of, and there was no organized settlement, like in the case of Crete. In Cyprus, those Venetians who settled permanently or temporarily on Cyprus did it individually at their own initiative.
Well, it's been said, and I wonder how you take this. It's been said that Venetian rule then was principally exploitative. Were the Venetians the only one who benefited during this era?
Well, the answer to the first part of your question is yes, and the second part is also yes. As a colonial relationship, I mean, every colonial relationship is to to some extent exploitative, at least, and that is also the case of Venice's rule of Cyprus. But they did it in an, I would even say, intelligent way. They understood that too harsh an exploitation would not be remunerative, and it will then take too much effort to keep the rule of, and face all kinds of difficulties. So I can give you an example. I mean, the most blatant example of exploitation is the salt monopoly. Throughout the Venetian dominions, the state had a monopoly as far as the salt production, trade, and the sale of salt throughout the Venetian Empire, I would say. So, Cyprus had a very, very big very big salt pans in the area of nowadays Larnaca, which the Venetians called Les Saline, which means the salt pans. This was the name of the place. And nature produced salt, because the salted water from the sea dried up in the lake during certain seasons, and all that Venice had to do was to pay very little sums to peasants whose duty was to collect the salt and transport it on the back of poor donkeys to the ships that moored opposite the salt pans. The legs of the donkeys were ruined doing
Yeah.
so. And then, I mean, it's quite an ingenious system, because Venice offered loans for shipbuilding in Venice, which could be paid back by transporting Cypriot salt to Venice again. So ship owners built ships with money received from the state as a loan, and then they transported the salt from Cyprus, and the salt even served them as ballast for the ships, because ships, have to have a ballast, something heavy and stable at the lower part of the ship to keep it stable in high sea. So the the salt was also served the round ships for that purpose. And Venice did not pay 1 ducat for this salt, nor for its transportation. And then the state sold the salt throughout the Venetian territories, also in northern Italy. I mean, this is an exploitation of a natural resource of the island, which does not even appear in the balance sheets of Venetian Cyprus, because no money was, was there was no money that was directly invested in that operation.
Now, at this time period, one of the, I suppose, rebuttals about this being a period of decline and decay is that we have a population boom. We know that Cyprus's population increases. I don't know if we can say it doubles. I don't know the numbers myself. And this seems to indicate a time of relative prosperity. But towards the end, there's a contraction in the population growth, if I'm not mistaken. I believe food needs to be imported at some point. And in 1566, there's even a food riot that leads to a rebellion and an execution of a priest. What happens in this period?
Well, I wouldn't use the term contraction, or how did you put it?
I
Construct.
said contraction, yeah.
Yeah, contraction. It's not a contraction. Probably even the opposite is true. What went wrong? You see, as long as on the island there were uncultivated lands, fertile lands, which were uh, not used for agriculture, and Venice could support the expansion of cultivated lands, relatively fertile cultivated lands, to support the demographic rise of the population. So most of it concerned, of course, the rural population, but also, of course, the urban population that did not produce any grains, especially. So this worked quite well until the, I would say, mid 50s. But there was a limit of fertile lands that could be added to those to the cultivated areas. And what began to become a problem was specifically the relation between the population rise that continued also, I think, during the 1560s, and the and the possibility to produce food for all these new Cypriots, if I
Okay.
can say so.
Yeah.
But the 1560s was also a period of other difficulties, not only concerning food supply, and no, still regarding food. The problem is that Venice too reached its maximum expansion. The city of Venice, its maximum expansion exactly in the 1560s, and there was huge pressure from Venice to send. Venice was used already to consume Cypriot grains, especially oats, but also all kinds of grains. And when in the 1560s the governor said, we cannot send you any grains anymore because we need them for our local consumption here in Cyprus, the Central Council of Government in Venice were furious. They were menacing the governors to punish them severely if they don't continue to send shiploads of grains. But very impressively, the Venetian governors, who were Venetian patricians, refrained from sending grain to Venice because they were convinced that the responsibility is to respond to the local demand for food. This is really a dramatic situation that is reflected in the exchange of letters, between the governors and the central. It was not only a local problem; it was at the level of the Venetian Empire in general. And then, of course, the 1560s, there are other problems. These were difficult years, also not only because of grain shortage, food shortage, but also because we are at the height of the campaign, the papal campaign of the counter-reformation. Catholic bishops that before preferred to live in Venice and receive the revenues of their Cypriot estates began to live in Cyprus, to stay and operate in, for instance, the Archbishop of Nicosia, Filippo Mocenigo, in the 1560s. He was a fanatic Catholic, and he wanted to impose the decisions of the Council of Trent, the counter Reformation reform, yes, of the church, to impose the decision, also doctrinal points that the Greeks would not agree to accept. So you see, there was a combination of different developments that transformed the 1560s into a rather difficult situation, to which one has also add the Ottoman pressure, because it was at the one point quite clear that the Ottomans were going to attack.
Right, and this flies in the face of Venice's pragmatic policy when it comes to religion, doesn't it? It's quite common for there to be intermarriages, intermingling of religious customs. So this is what the Archbishop is trying to stamp out, essentially.
I mean, there was a doctrinal disagreement, of course, between the Catholics and the Orthodox Greeks on the point of many points, but also about priest marriage, of course.
We're almost nearing the eve of the Ottoman conquest, but before we get to that, I do have one final question about the landscape, so to speak. We know that the villages at the time are generally homogenous. I believe most are Greek-speaking Orthodox Christians, except for the towns. The towns, you call them kaleidoscopic in nature. We have Syrians, we have Jews emigrating from Spain and Portugal. What do we know about the indigenous, or was there an indigenous Jewish community at the time in Cyprus?
Yeah, there was, speaking about the Venetian period, a Jewish community, not very big, not very numerous actually, in Famagusta. There was a Jewish quarter around a sort of camp or piazza, and synagogue, of course. And we have even the list of names, because at one point they were suspected as collaborators with the potential Ottoman enemies, and decision was taken to banish those Jews who were not born in Cyprus. So we have a detailed list of all the heads of household, at least Jewish heads of household in Famagusta. But that was not a novelty. I mean, they were there also before the Venetians, and there were there also, at least partly, very few of them also under the Ottomans.
What would you say was the impact of the Italian and Venetian culture on Cyprus during those 100 or so years? For example, language, art, I guess the linguistic, literary, and religious spheres. Was it a lasting impact?
There was, I collaborated in a collective volume published a few years ago entitled Cyprus and the Renaissance, which tried to to respond some of the questions that you raised now. There was certainly some sort of impact, I would say. I mean, my Cypriot colleagues, historians of art, are always reiterate are very impressed, and I also am also impressed by the number of small churches and chapels built in, especially in the mountainous areas of Cyprus during the Venetian period. It was beautiful frescoes on the walls, which I would not describe. I'm not an art historian, but I would not describe them as that remind me of Venetian, contemporary contemporaneous Venetian art or frescoes. I mean, this is a provincial art, but very very fascinating as far as I'm concerned, and beautiful also. These are painters. Some of them are known by their name, but others not. It is a reflection of a certain degree of well-being. I think building so many churches and decorating them means people had some means to invest in them and enjoy them later. As far as literature and language are concerned, well, language is for me easier to refer to because I've gone through many written documents. Actually, this is interesting. Italian, some sort of Italian, I would say, is replacing French already before the Venetian takeover in Cyprus. It is a kind of lingua franca of the Mediterranean, you see. And
This is because Venetian and Genoese activity in the Mediterranean,
yes,
I would suppose.
yes, and Cyprus was not a closed island. I mean, people were coming and going, and they also the Franciscans and the Dominicans and so on. Most of them were Italian, were settling the island and active there, and so this is even I remember a small letter written by King Jacques de Lusignan himself, in a sort of a bit funny Italian, I would say, but but there was certainly a linguistic impact, and there are linguists that are studied these processes. I'm not an expert in this field. As far as I think music, there are some scholars who study music. Yes, the development of Cypriot music and its relation with the with Venice. I think yes, Tassos Papakostas did some work on that.
The the 1570s, or rather 1570, is the beginning of the Ottoman invasion. And there's I forget who actually said this. I believe it was said during the attack on Constantinople in 1453. But the saying, "Better the turban than the Turkish turban
Yes.
than the mitre, the Roman Catholic mitre." And this is something that has been said quite often to describe the general dissatisfaction with Latins and Western rule. Now, was there generally a divide between serfs and Greek nobility when the Ottomans invaded? Because many studies have suggested the Ottoman conquest and the abolition of serfdom brought a huge relief. And it's been suggested that serfs welcomed this change. They saw the Ottomans as, in a sense, liberators. And we do know that nobles, Cypriot nobles, Greek nobles, did fight to protect Nicosia and Famagusta, but it's a little gray, this area for me. It's a little gray. Could you bring any clarity to this?
Well, this contention is part of the Black Legend, and but it does not go back to Maslatri, or probably it does. No, it does not actually. It does not, but it's one of the additions, by other authors who thought that would suit the general pejorative description of Venetian rule. Now, a Turkish scholar, very important, the Turkish scholar called Halil Inalcik. I don't know if you came across his name. He's well known. Published an article that was republished 3 times already, based on Ottoman documentation, and mainly the documents when the Ottomans conquered a new territory and preparing to introduce to integrate it into their empire, the way to do it was to sending government officials, Ottoman officials, to the new territory, investigating what was especially the fiscal organization of the territory under the former regime, in this case, the Venetian regime, and then after sending to the central organs of government of the Ottoman Empire their conclusions, and the central organs would then decide what will remain intact, what will be changed, what will be added, what will be removed, etc. And this appears in a sort of founding document that is called Kanun, where the description of the former fiscal regime is described, and the new regime is detailed, and the details of the new regime, with the details of the new regime following. Now, this document exists in the Ottoman Empire, in the Ottoman archives, and was published by Khalil Naljic with his interpretation. Now, what my good colleague, the late and dear friend, the late Gilles Weinstein, and myself collaborated in examining this analysis published by Khalil Naljic, and no less so, the way in which the former fiscal regime is described by the Ottomans themselves in 1572, we came to the conclusion that the Ottomans simply did not understand the terminology of the Cypriot Venetian fiscal system. They did not understand the distinction between serfs and Francomati and free peasants, and although they declare they wanted to alleviate the fiscal load upon the different peasants, but what they did was often quite the opposite, because of the limitations of, the situation was it was very difficult to make such an investigation in 1572 on the ground. The country was quite ruined. The island was quite ruined. There were not enough people who could explain what the terminology means, etc. So according to our investigation, our research, Gilles Weinstein and myself, Gilles, with great expert of the Ottoman Empire, and me, specializing in Venetian Cyprus, we came to the conclusion that the serfs, if we speak only about serfs, did not have a good reason to welcome the Ottomans with open hands. They did not. They had no choice. They had no choice, of course. They had to do it because the Ottoman army was much stronger than they could not. They could not stand against the Ottoman army, especially if they lived in their villages. But the change was very often not for the better. The result of the change of regime, and in some cases the Ottomans themselves realized at some point that they were wrong, that they did not read the situation properly, and they tried to correct, but that took them a few years to realize.
What happened to these noble families in Venice after the conquest in 1571? Not in Venice, in Cyprus.
Well, some of them were killed. For instance, some of the Singlitico died defending Nicosia alongside the Venetian officials and soldiers. Some of them managed to escape even before the invasion or during or after that. None of them remain in Cyprus.
So it's sort of a reset, if I could use that terminology, with the arrival of the Ottomans. We have no more noble families. We have,
Well,
I
you have
suppose,
a sort of not. This is not a nobility on the Western model of nobility, but the pashas, the Turkish pashas, were sort of nobility. I mean, yes, it was not
um,
a hereditary nobility like the Western one, but yes.
Benjamin, it has been truly a pleasure and an honor to have you with us today to share your wealth of knowledge in this really important period in Cypriot history. So again, I want to thank you so much. It was really, really enlightening having this conversation.
Thank you, Andreas. I enjoyed it very much too, and I am glad we did it. It was a pleasure collaborating with your initiative. I'm glad, and thank you for inviting me to take part in it.